The United Nations Hall was full, its ceiling lights casting a glow over the gathered representatives of almost every nation on Earth. The chatter was low but constant, the anticipation thick. This was one of those days when something was bound to happen, when history felt close, even if no one yet knew what shape it would take. And as the cameras adjusted their focus and the translators readied their headsets, a figure familiar to the world stepped toward the podium. Donald Trump, former President of the United States, carried himself with the same theatrical presence that had always marked his appearances on the global stage. He straightened his jacket, paused for effect, then leaned into the microphone with that unmistakable cadence. The hall hushed. Trump spoke of America first, of strength, of how his administration had challenged the global order and refused to bow to the old systems that kept the United States footing the bill for everyone else. His words had that punchy rhythm that made supporters cheer and critics bristle. He didn't mince words about corruption in global institutions, about how too many nations had taken America's generosity for granted. Then, as he often did, he pivoted toward Africa. He spoke of nations that, in his view, needed to clean up their act. He called out leaders who misused aid, who sat at the United Nations with equal votes to the United States, yet depended on American taxpayers to fund their governments. The words were blunt, cutting, and they traveled across the room like sharp winds. Cameras zoomed in on delegates shifting in their seats. Some looked down, others whispered, and then he said something that would ignite the spark. With a tone both mocking and dismissive, Trump joked about leaders from poor countries showing up in suits paid for by foreign donors, speaking lofty words while their own people went hungry. He smirked, shrugged, and said, "Some of these leaders wouldn't last a week if the foreign money dried up. We all know it. They talk about pride and dignity, but let's be honest. They're standing here because others are paying their bills." The comment drew gasps, nervous laughter, and some visible scowls. For Trump, this was classic showmanship, the kind of provocation that played well to his base, that broke the stiffness of UN speeches and forced headlines. But on this day in this hall, someone decided not to let it pass. From the seats reserved for African delegations, a young man rose. His uniform was striking, military green with insignia that gleamed under the lights, a red beret tilted at an angle that symbolized discipline and defiance. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional president of Burkina Faso, walked slowly toward the microphone reserved for responses. The hall grew silent again, this time charged with tension, when few dared to interrupt a figure like Trump at the UN. But here was a young African leader, unafraid, his eyes locked forward, his steps echoing in the stillness. Traoré's voice cut through the hall, calm at first, almost gentle, but layered with steel. "Monsieur Trump," he began, "you speak of pride and dignity as though they were commodities bought with dollars. You say we stand here because of foreign money. Let me tell you, Africa stands here because of history, because of survival, because of the blood of our ancestors who endured centuries of chains, theft, and humiliation. And yet we still rise." His words were measured, but each sentence carried the weight of generations. Delegates leaned in. Translators rushed to keep up. Trump stood at the podium, expression hard to read, but his body language betrayed irritation. He had not expected to be confronted, not in this way, not with such poetic defiance. Traoré continued. He spoke of Burkina Faso's fight against terrorism without the endless strings attached to foreign aid. He reminded the hall that Africa's resources, its gold, its cobalt, its oil, had fueled the prosperity of the very nations now lecturing Africans about self-reliance. He raised his voice slightly. "You speak as though we should be ashamed. But tell me, Mr. Trump, should America be ashamed for the trillions it borrows, for the debts it leaves to its children? Should Europe be ashamed for the wars it exported that devastated continents? If we are measured only by money, then who among us is truly free?" There was a pause, and then applause broke out. It wasn't thunderous, but it was enough to send ripples through the chamber. Cameras flashed toward the African blocs, where heads nodded, eyes glistened. Trump adjusted his stance, but Traoré wasn't finished. With passion rising, Traoré leaned into the microphone. We do not measure dignity in dollars. We do not measure sovereignty in aid packages. We measure it in the courage of our people who, with nothing, still stand tall. You mock our suits. But remember, it was your corporations who stripped our lands to build their skyscrapers. You mock our leaders. But remember, it was your policies that armed the groups we now fight. You speak of survival, Mr. Trump, but Africa has been surviving for 500 years against all odds. Do not confuse survival with weakness. The chamber stirred. Some delegates clapped softly, others sat frozen. Trump, ever quick on his feet, leaned into the microphone again, but before he could speak, Traoré delivered the line that would echo far beyond the UN walls. He said, "We will no longer shake the hands of those who offer us humiliation disguised as help. Africa's hands are not begging hands. They are the hands of builders, of fighters, of free people. If you cannot see that, then perhaps the embarrassment is not ours but yours." The words landed like a thunderclap, even through the polished decorum of the UN. You could feel the electricity in the air. Delegates looked at one another, mouths half open, unsure whether to applaud or remain silent. The cameras captured Trump narrowing his eyes, jaw tightening, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had faced protests, hecklers, and hostile questions throughout his career, but here, in front of the world, an African leader had called him out with fire and dignity. For a moment, the hall was suspended in silence. Then the applause began again, louder this time, building in waves. Some delegates even rose to their feet. African representatives clapped in unison, and the sound carried like a drumbeat of solidarity. Traoré stepped back, folded his arms, and returned to his seat, leaving Trump standing at the podium under the heavy gaze of the world. The American media exploded within minutes. Clips of the exchange circulated on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, each with captions like, "African leader schools Trump," and "Savage response at UN." Yet in America, the reactions were split in fascinating ways. Trump's supporters admired his boldness in calling out corruption and dependency, arguing that he had said what no one else dared to say. At the same time, even some conservatives admitted that Traoré's response was sharp, eloquent, and undeniable. It wasn't anti-American, they said it was anti-humiliation. And that was a distinction that even pro-American audiences could respect. Fox News framed it as a clash of strong personalities, proof that Trump's blunt style still commanded the spotlight. CNN portrayed it as a humiliation, a symbol of America's declining moral authority. Across YouTube, independent creators replayed Traoré's words, setting them against dramatic music, racking up millions of views. The phrase, "hands of builders, not begging hands," became a rallying cry online, quoted in memes, tweets, and even protest signs in cities across Africa. In Burkina Faso, crowds poured into the streets to celebrate. Graffiti appeared overnight, a hand breaking free from chains, painted under the words, "Not begging hands." Rappers sampled Traoré's speech in their tracks. DJs mixed it into club beats, and schoolchildren recited lines from it in classrooms. In Harlem, a muralist painted Traoré's face next to the words, "Africa still rises," and it drew crowds who snapped selfies beneath it. But in America, something interesting happened too. Conservative commentators, usually dismissive of African leaders, found themselves respecting Traoré's stance. They argued that his words echoed Trump's own philosophy of dignity, of putting your people first, of refusing to bow to global institutions. One popular host said, "Traoré just pulled a Trump on Trump. He told him, in essence, America first. Well, Africa first too. And you know what? That's something Trump himself should admire." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In the days that followed, the exchange became more than just a viral clip. It turned into a doctrine, a new principle whispered in diplomatic corridors. The phrase, "no handshake of humiliation," began to circulate. African diplomats used it to reject deals that came with too many strings. European leaders referenced it when discussing sovereignty. Even in Washington, aides debated whether this moment signaled a shift in how African nations would engage with the West. Trump himself, never one to admit defeat, tried to spin it. At a rally in the Midwest, he told supporters, Did you see what happened at the UN? I told them the truth, and they couldn't handle it. One of them got up, gave a speech fine. But you know what? At least he respects his country. At least he's not asking America to do everything. So maybe we agree on one thing: take care of your own people. That's America first. That's Burkina Faso first. That's how it should be. His crowd roared. Somehow, Trump managed to turn even an apparent embarrassment into fuel for his populist message. But the image stuck. The former American president caught off guard, the African leader standing tall, the hall echoing with applause. It was replayed again and again on late-night television, on podcasts, in classrooms studying modern diplomacy. Analysts compared it to Khrushchev banging his shoe at the UN, to Castro's fiery speeches, to Mandela's dignified rebukes. They said this was one of those rare, unscripted moments when the world glimpses a shift, when the stagecraft of politics cracks and something raw and real slips through. And for pro-American audiences, the lesson was not humiliation but humility. Trar's words didn't diminish America. They challenged it to be better, to treat allies with dignity, to live up to its own ideals. To many, the embarrassment was temporary, but the respect gained for bold speech and truth-telling was lasting. In fact, some American commentators argued that this was exactly why Trump resonated with so many, because he himself had spent years saying the uncomfortable truths, breaking with convention, refusing to bow. And when faced with that same energy from another leader, the mirror was simply too sharp to ignore. Weeks later, a student debate at Harvard featured Trar's speech as a case study. A young American student stood and said, "What struck me wasn't that Trump was embarrassed. What struck me was that for once, Africa spoke back, not with begging, not with excuses, but with pride. And that's a language Americans should understand, because at its best, America doesn't beg either. It builds, it fights, it stands tall." The room applauded. In that sense, Trar's words had crossed oceans, not as an attack on America, but as an affirmation of the very values America itself claimed to uphold. The moment lived on in hashtags, in murals, in late-night jokes, in academic debates, in diplomatic circles. It was dissected, reinterpreted, spun, celebrated, criticized. But above all, it was remembered. Trump's most embarrassing moment, maybe, but also a moment that proved the stage of the UN still had the power to surprise, to jolt the world awake, to remind nations that dignity is not given, it is claimed. And on that day, in that hall, an African leader claimed it with words that will echo for generations.